In the late 1950s, Fenella had been studying at a secretarial college. She had no clear idea of what to do, but it was time to find a job.
And the college suggested to me they had a potential job at Moorfields Eye Hospital. And my mother then suggested it might be worth my writing to the BBC. And we must have had television by that time, but I can't say that I had any great opportunity to watch it. Anyhow, I duly wrote both to Moorfields and to the BBC, and I got a letter back from the BBC which set me interview date, and I got a letter back from Moorfields saying yes, they would be interested in giving me an interview. And their interview was set for the following week after my BBC interview. Anyhow, I thought I ought to be very proper. So my aunt very kindly accompanied me on my search for what I considered to be a suitable outfit for an interview, for a job. And this, of course, was by now 1957. As a woman, you wore a costume as a jacket and skirt. And I had a blue costume with blue court shoes, and I had white gloves, white cotton gloves, and a blue handbag. And when I went up for the interview, it occurred to me that I really ought to have a hat. So I then went into, I think, somewhere like Marshall and Snellgrove, which was a store on Piccadilly, and bought myself a hat which looked a bit like an inverted soup plate, I seem to remember. Anyhow, when I came out of Marshall and Snellgrove, I was due to get myself to Portland Place for the interview. And I wasn't entirely sure exactly where that was, so I thought, well, summon a taxi. And it so happened that there was a couple in front of me who had also summoned a taxi. And a taxi duly turned up and drew up in front of them. I think they must have been American, because they took one look at the driver, who was extremely dark-skinned and had obviously come from the West Indies, I assume. And they didn't want to have that driver driving them, which I can remember feeling quite stunned about. So I said, "Oh, is it all right? Can I have the taxi?" Oh, yes, they backed away, and the driver, I can't have been very far away, of course. I mean, Piccadilly and just up Regent Street, yes, up to Portland Place. Yes. But I can remember feeling quite horrified that anybody should have behaved like that.
Interesting, yes.
Anyhow, I duly had my interview I took my hat off, actually, having sort of shaken the hand of, I think, possibly Yvonne Lark, who was most likely the woman who would have interviewed me. And she took me through the paces or whatever, and sample and dictation and transcription and all that sort of thing, and typing. Or she gave me, I assume standard, a dictation, which you then had to transcribe and type out, obviously. And then there were various other questions that there was asked of you, about your background and your training and all the rest of it. And, of course, also your parents and all that sort of detail of family and so on. And then I was duly told, yes, they would let me know. And I think by the end of that week, I had this letter from the BBC saying, yes, they were prepared to offer me a job as a sort of clerk secretary, and they were prepared to offer me £7.06 per week wages. Now, it so happened that the letter I had had from the Moorfields Hospital had been prepared to offer me £5 a week. And I really felt that £2 was a lot of difference. And so I rang up Moorfields and explained that I'd had this offer of the £7.06 from the BBC, and that as they were prepared to offer me at Moorfields only the £5, I really felt that it wasn't fair to go and have an interview with him, because obviously £7 is a lot better than the £5. So I could hear now his sigh as he sort of thought to himself, obviously, the BBC must have been recruiting, and there was he, left having to search again for a potential secretary. I really don't know what happened about that.
An important, you could have gone either way. You could have ended up in the health service or
well,
ended
I
up
could have done.
Yes.
I mean, if I'd gone to the Moorfields first, maybe I would have thought they were lovely people and much nicer to stay with.
Yes.
Anyhow, I can remember the first time I went to pick up my wages, which were literally cash in hand. And I had been given a staff number. So you had to go to Bank Buildings, which was just by Barclays Bank, sort of between Barclays and the side of the Langham Hotel. And you went in there on a Friday, lunchtime, I think you could go, because you were paid in arrears, and you had to give your name and staff number, and literally you were then given a small brown envelope which had a slip of paper in it, which was about an inch deep, I would say, and probably about a foot wide, and that was actually detailed your wages.
The payslip.
And your payslip
Yeah.
was itemised with what you were getting and what the deductions were. And I would get, from my £7.06 gross, I would get £6, 3 and 6pence net. And of course I then gave half of that, £3, 3 shillings, to my mother. So I had £3 and 6pence for the week's expenses, which obviously had to cover my travel and my lunchtime meal and teas and whatever else I wanted during the day, and also anything like stockings and underwear and blouses and anything else, that girls would want.
Were you expected to dress in a particular way?
Oh yeah, I think we were expected to look neat, and we wore a skirt or a frock in the summer. You certainly didn't wear trousers. And it wasn't until the very cold winter of 1963 that if you had progressed to be working on a programme, by that time it was acceptable to wear trousers. But certainly you did not wear trousers as a secretary. There was no question of that.
Can you remember your first day at the BBC? I mean, where did you work? What was it like?
Right. I had the letter offering me a job, and then I had to reply saying, yes, I was happy to take up the job. And they then had another letter telling me I had to report, and I think it was to a building in Luxborough Street, and I had a week's induction course, and we had to do the BBC way of doing things. So we were introduced to BBC memoranda forms and letter forms, and we had to do dictation and all that sort of thing, and transcription. And we were also shown a little film showing us the difference between what a proper secretary did and what a less proper secretary did. And the proper secretary always answered the phone by saying, Mr. Brown's office, how can I help you? Or whatever. And, oh yes, and you would neatly take a message and you would have to say, hold on please, just a moment, and I'll put you through. Or else you would take a message and say, Mr. Brown is out at the moment at a meeting, but, I will blah, blah, blah. The less proper way to take was if somebody rang up and you sort of drawled in a rather casual voice, oh, Peter Brown's office. And then, he's out at lunch at the moment. I don't know when he'll be back, etc., etc. And we thought, well, that was much more realistic, or seemed much more realistic to us, because we knew by then that if somebody was out to lunch, that probably meant they were out at the pub or in the club or something like that. And the idea of, oh yes, well, I'll give him a message if you want to leave something, that sort of. So we thought we rather approved of the less good or less official way of answering the telephone, because we felt it was much more natural.
How very funny. Oh, so you were working in Central London, but for what department? Do you remember what you were doing?
Right, I was then assigned to work in shipping, and I don't think it was only a temporary job, it wasn't a permanent job. But shipping dealt with forms mainly, and at that time the BBC had innumerable stations around the world, obviously mainly Commonwealth stations, Empire stations I suppose they would be, and we would have to fill in the forms that were customs forms for sending tapes, transcription tapes around the place. And normally it would be about 3 copies of the form. But I do remember that for some reasons what was then Ceylon wanted 5 copies of the form. So you had to really bash the keys on the typewriter quite hard to make sure that the 5th copy was legible.
Yes.
And the other thing I do remember about that particular little office was that there were 2 other women there, and each of them had completely different shorthand. So that although I did Pitman's shorthand, one of them did, I think, what was known as Macmillan, and one of them did a completely other language shorthand. So neither one of us could read any of the other two's shorthand. So I don't know quite why there were all these different shorthands, but we were no help to anybody. And the other thing I do remember was I used to have to, the paper would be delivered to the office, and I would have to cut out the monetary exchange rates. And I think that was so that one of the shipping clerks could assess and calculate the correct postage or whatever that would be necessary for sending. Everything went presumably by airmail, post of some sort.
Were you responsible for packaging up tapes?
No, we never saw any of the packages or tapes or anything of that sort. It was all purely paperwork and forms.
Yes.
But that was only a temporary job, and I then was assigned to a more proper job, and I went to what was called Central Services. So again, it was an admin job. The head of Central Services was a chap called Peter Florence, and he had 2 chaps underneath him, one of whom was a Mr. Dormer, and then the other assistant was a chap called Bert Lamb, and he was my boss. I was assigned to Mr. Lamb. He looked after premises, so buildings. So I then discovered how many buildings the BBC was responsible for, because there were innumerable buildings that the BBC leased as well as owned. And at that time, of course, Broadcasting House itself was owned by the BBC, and the Langham Hotel was owned by the BBC. And then there were 1, 3 and 5 Portland Place. There was Egton House. Mm-hmm. There was Cavendish Mansions. There was Bank Buildings. Mm-hmm. There was Aeolian Hall. There was also subsequently Henry Woodhouse. There was 2 and 4 Cavendish Square. There was Marylebone High Street. There was the Redbourne Hotel itself, which was at that time used as offices. There was Beaumont Mews, which was used as a hostel for young men who were engineers. And there was Aeolian Hall, of course, which was where the light programme was based in the music department. Bush House, and there was 200 Oxford Street. There were 2 radio audience theatres. One was the Piccadilly Theatre, and I think one was a cameo theatre in Regent's Street of some sort.
Was the Camden Theatre also there?
Maybe Camden Theatre. And then, of course, there were the television buildings, Lime Grove and Television Centre, Kensington House, Woodstock Grove, Selgrave House, Centre House, film studios subsequently. Yeah. But one of the things that Mr. Lamb also dealt with was television rehearsal rooms, because there were no actual block of television rehearsal rooms at that time, which they subsequently had at Wales Farm Road. And so Mr. Lamb would take me on occasions with him to go and have a look at church halls and boys' clubs and Masonic halls and so on. And they had to be at least 60 feet long by 30 feet wide, and obviously not used during the day, because they had to be available between basically 10 in the morning and 6 at night. And they had to have open space so that the set could be actually lined out with tape and so on the floor. And the one thing that was extremely important was that, of course, the halls had to have telephones, because actors and actresses and directors and what have you were always on the phone. But, of course, you couldn't have the church or the Masonic or the Boys' Club paying for phone calls. So we had to have an arrangement whereby the post office, General Post Office, came in and put in a pay phone, an A and B, press button A, press button B phone. So they had to be fitted into the halls if it was a new hall to be, established. Otherwise, of course, there could have been a phone in there in any case, which had already been set up.
No free calls, you had to pay for them.
No. Well, hardly. Not fair on the boys or the churches or whatever, because actors would always immediately go to the phone at lunchtime or whatever,
Call their agents.
For their agents, exactly. Yeah. So I was still doing admin work at that time.
But you were getting to know the BBC, where it was.
Obviously. And I can remember actually going to 200 Oxford Street because there was a very nice canteen there. But it wasn't there for very long. I mean, there was actually, I think, a plaque set up in 200 Oxford Street, because it had been a base in the Second World War for transmission of programmes in one way or another. The building was taken over by what was then the C&A store. And I think there was a plaque inside. But I don't know what happened to it since, because obviously C&A pulled out eventually and it was taken over by whatever else.
Yeah. So you got to know the BBC's buildings. The canteens were clearly quite good, I imagine. And what were you paying for a meal, typically? Do you remember?
I mean, having had umpteen dozen years of school and institutional dinners, I mean, as far as I was concerned, I was quite happy to eat pretty much whatever was set before me.
Right. What about the BBC Club? Did you go to that?
I did, occasionally. I can't say I made a great thing of it. What I did do, though, was Mr. Dormer, his secretary, was a lass called Linda, and she and I used to go to the ballroom dancing section, which was on a Monday evening from 8 until 10, and was held somewhere in Paddington. And also, we used to go to the Queen's Club ice skating, which was where the club had its ice skating outfit. Occasionally, we used to see Courtney Jones and Doreen Denny, who were at that time, I think, the British pairs skating champions. And I also joined the BBC Club Library, which had its base in the Langham Hotel. So I would enjoy going over there at lunchtime probably and borrowing a book or whatever.
The BBC had the whole of the Langham.
Yes.
And it had these wonderfully old-fashioned lifts.
That's right. I mean, I actually worked in the Langham while I was still in radio. What happened was that the BBC decided it was going to downsize, and so it was agreed that Mr. Dormer and Mr. Lamb should have a secretary instead of one each. And so Linda, who had moved around a bit in any case, she didn't want to move on again, and so it was agreed that I would move, and I was put on to secretarial reserve. Now, maybe I should also mention, just as a by-the-by, the BBC was very civil service in those days, and the people in central services, Mr. Florence and both Mr. Dormer and Mr. Lamb, had hand towels which were delivered once a week. The old towel was taken away and the new towel clean towel would be given. And I was obviously getting dirty hands with carbon papers and all the rest of it. And so I did inquire whether I couldn't have a hand towel. And it was agreed.
Oh, gosh.
So I actually also had a hand towel.
Early perks, yes.
And, believe it or not. And also, the other thing I do remember was I used to have to keep a post book there. So all the memorandum and all the letters and anything that came in had to be entered in the post book. And then you simply referred back to that if you wanted to know where and when you had last had dealings with somebody, because you could tell from your cross-reference where things were. Which seemed to me quite a good idea. I mean,
Yes.
Even today I tend to write the date I receive things on whatever correspondence I get from, bills or whatever else I get. Anyhow, I then went on to secretarial reserve. And I then spent about 2 or 3 weeks on contracts which were in Duchess Street. And you had to be absolutely correct. There was no question. It was a contract. If you made a mistake, you had to start all over again. You had to be absolutely precise. And that was a legal requirement. It was very much dinned into you. And then I had...
So you were learning how much people were getting?
Yes, I mean, the BBC paid in guineas, obviously. So if you gave a talk, shall we say a 15-minute talk,
Yes.
you were probably paid 3 guineas for that. And if you were a contributor, shall we say the Today programme, or I think then you would be paid a guinea or something, depending on how important you were, probably, and
But
all the rest of that.
Most people who appeared would get a fee,
Yes, as far as I know.
unlike
yes.
nowadays.
I mean, obviously, programmes like Today, or Woman's Hour, or whatever it happened to be, had their own unit manager, or the equivalent of, and they, I think, would probably send a whole reef of stuff for contracts or payments to be made, which you had to do, one way and another.
Who was paid the most, do you think, that you
Oh
saw?
gosh, I'm not sure. I can't.
I mean, if
I don't.
John Gielgud came in to do
Oh, I
something
think
like
that would have been handled under a drama contract with an agent and that sort of thing.
yes,
I mean, this contracts department that I work with was purely casual type things.
yes,
If somebody was doing a talk about listening to the lark in the morning or whatever it was, that would be a sort of one-off thing. It wasn't like it was a production in the same way. We simply had to fill in the form that said you have participated in this programme or
yes,
you've done this, whatever it is,
yes.
whatever.
There's presumably a copyright or
Yes,
rights
whatever,
issue
copyright,
there. Yes,
yes.
quite. Okay.
So I don't think we never handled cheques or money in any way at all.
No,
You just had to be very precise.
But the sort of amounts that people were getting for appearing in a programme, incidentally or something like that, being interviewed possibly, would be, a few guineas.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Okay. Well,
Before I got to programme work, I then went to the Malay department in Bush House. And the organiser, or whatever he was called, was a chap called Mr. Morgan. And the one thing I do remember, I only had 3 days there, I think. But I seem to remember that we had to type out news bulletins and continuity announcements or whatever for the Malay service. And the Malay lads would then come in and fetch what you'd written in English, and then they would translate it into Malay.
yes.
And then it would be brought back to you, and we had to type, or I had to type out whatever this was. And it must have been possible to type it with a standard, European script typewriter. And what I do remember, though, was that there wasn't a plural in Malay, in the language. And where we would have a figure S, as far as the Malay language was concerned, you repeated the word. So you simply put a figure 2 on the end of the word. So if you wanted tables and chairs, you would say table, table, and chair, chair. But you would just put table 2 and chair 2, whatever. So I'm afraid that's all I remember about the Malay section.
Right. But were you working at Bush House for that?
I worked in Bush House, but only for the 3 days.
Oh, I see. That's a short
That
time.
was it. And I can remember enjoying going to the Bush House canteen, of course, because it had marvellous selection of food of some
Legendary,
sort or
yes,
other.
legendary. Okay, so after that, what happened
And
to you
then I went to foreign news.
Oh.
And I think I had about 3 weeks of foreign news. Now, foreign news was based in Egton House. And this was radio foreign news, of course. And the head of foreign news was a chap called Gerald Norman. And I think subsequently he had a daughter called Geraldine Norman, who was, I think, became a presenter briefly.
Yeah.
Anyhow, they recorded, Alistair Cook's letter from America, and they also recorded from our own correspondent. And I seem to remember that Alistair Cook's letter from America would, I think, be recorded on a Friday at about 4 o'clock UK time, but would have been about 10 o'clock his US New York time. And then the From Our Own correspondent would come through during the week as and when the correspondents felt they got something to say. And then it would be edited in time, I think, for Thursday for whatever transmission. So that would be done once a week. And there was a lot of ticker tape around, of course, in those days. And at that time, I then began to think to myself, I would really rather like to work in a programme rather than, always being an admin secretary.
Yes.
So I think I probably got in touch with Yvonne Lugg and said I really would like to work. Anyhow, I think I was given another test of some sort. Mm-hmm. And I can't say my shorthand was marvellous, but it was adequate.
Yeah.
And so I was then assigned to a radio secretary and went to work for a woman called Barbara Crowther. And she had offices in what were then Cavendish Mansions, which was alongside Edgecombe House. Anyhow, I started off in radio with Barbara Crowther, and she did a series of little talks for the Today programme, which of course was then presented by Jack Domanio.
Yep.
And Barbara did a shopping list, it was called, with a woman called Louise Davis. And Louise would go out and investigate prices of goods in the shops. And it was a little sort of 5-minute, if that, talk. And it was twice a week, I think, that was done, shall we say, on a Tuesday and a Friday or something like that, which was part of the Today programme. And Louise would come in the day before, in the afternoon, and record her suggested prices and tips and things that she'd done. And that would then go to the Today programme and be transmitted. And they were always looking for something new on the Today programme. And I happened to have a book all about dreams, depending on what your dreams were about and if you remembered.
Yes.
And so I offered this to the Today programme as a loan, and Jack Domanio had quite fun looking through it and quoting if you dreamt about a crocodile or if you dreamt you were being, on a boat or something. I don't know quite what it was, but anyhow, they chose quite a few bits and pieces from that.
Right.
And then, but I didn't have to be up at crack of dawn in the morning for any reason. And Barbara Crowther also did a little sort of DIY type column with a chap called David Rowe. And I never met him. He always sent in his scripts, which I would then type out, and Barbara would then discuss them with him on the phone, and she would then record him, and I never went to the studio for some reason. He would then do his weekly tip for the Today programme.
So you weren't spending any time in studios. You were still, as it were, at the back office.
She didn't take me to the studio.
No, but you were dealing with scripts and
not
things
on
of
a
that
regular
kind.
basis.
Yeah.
But she did do 2 series totally separately. One which was about dogs and dog breeding and dog behaviour and all the rest of it. And I think it was a little 5-part series. And then she did another series called The Cat, which again was, about breeding cats and totally separate, nothing to do with the Today programme. And the one thing about Barbara was that her left arm was slightly shorter than her right arm. And the BBC employed X thousand people, and therefore it was required to employ, shall we say, I think it was 3% of disabled people. And Barbara was a bit annoyed because she had a letter from personnel, as they were known, saying that they were a bit down on the numbers of disabled people they were supposed to have. And would she be prepared to be classed as disabled because of her short left arm? And she was very irritated by this and got in touch with personnel and said, I'm perfectly possible, I can... The fact that I have this short left arm has got nothing to do with my capacity to be a producer, So, no, I'm not going to be disabled under your terms. What she did do, though, was I can remember going with her somewhere, and she drove a Mini, and that had a very long gear stick. The original Minis had a very long gear stick. So she was perfectly okay driving a car with a long gear stick.
Yes.
That's right,
Yes. Yes.
up sort of waist level
How
almost.
funny.
I wasn't very long on the reserve. I was only about a month or so on the reserve, probably a couple of months, December, January, February possibly. And I went to join Barbara, and certainly by the March, and that was 1958.
Oh,
So it was quite early in my career.
yes.
The original Ideal Home exhibition had first been held in 1908. So 1958 was the 50th anniversary. So through Woman's Hour, they put out an appeal. Was there anybody who had gone to the first Ideal Home in 1908? And we had about half a dozen replies, and Barbara was assigned to look after it. But at that time, there was a man called Morgan Phillips, who was the secretary, I think, of the Labour Party.
Yes.
And he had recently died. And the woman that they got in touch with about this 50th anniversary, she was a Mrs. Phillips. And it so happened that I had a call while Barbara was out of the office. And the woman at the other end of the line said she was Mrs. Phillips. And I can remember thinking, oh gosh, I wonder which Mrs. Phillips this is. Because Woman's Hour had arranged to do an interview with Morgan Phillips's widow. I thought, oh gosh, which Mrs. Phillips is it? So I said, please forgive me for asking, but is your husband alive? And it turned out it was the woman who had been to the Ideal Home exhibition. So fortunately, she didn't take it amiss and said, yes, he was.
He was.
Her husband was alive.
Right.
And so I was able to sort of get her number and all the rest of it.
Yes.
And Barbara later got in touch with her and sorted it all out and arranged, and she came in and did an interview. And it would have been that sort of thing that I would have got in touch with contracts for, to give her a contract for doing whatever she did.
I hope you dealt with the telephone call in the approved BBC manner.
I would hope so, yes.
Right.
I hope I was suitably sympathetic. I asked in the right tone.
Okay, so you're moving around still on a panel, are you?
No, at this point I am definitely radio secretary to Barbara. So I
see, right.
ceased being on the panel on the reserve. Mm-hmm. Once I joined Barbara Crowther, I was then a radio secretary.
Yeah.
I think Barbara was married, and I think she had a little boy already. Anyhow, she got pregnant again, and so she took maternity leave. And for something like a couple of months, I then went to work for Woman's Hour, and I worked with Joanna Scott Moncrief, who was the editor, and Madge Hart, who is the assistant editor, and I was their joint secretary to Woman's Hour for about 10, 11, 12 weeks, something like that. The agreement was that because if you were a secretary to the head of a unit like that, then you were a grade up. And so I was paid for the first 4 weeks, you had to work at the same grade as you would normally. But if you then worked longer than that, they would then pay you at the upper rate for the remaining time that you did. So I actually got a bit of extra pay for the remaining 6-7 weeks that I did for that. Then I also went to work with a chap called Jack Singleton, who did a series called Home This Afternoon, which was obviously for people either retired or home workers or a sort of replacement for Woman's Hour, alternative to Woman's Hour, because it was a light programme and it was introduced, presented by a chap called John Dunn, who was one of the in those days, light programme announcers, but he was also, he'd presented this Home This Afternoon. And certainly at that time, I was in the studio then having to do timings and things like that. And then after that, I went to work for 3 producers all at the same time. They were all part-time and they all had offices in the Langham. They all did individual, separate talks of one sort or another. And there was a chap called Richard Keane. Then there was another chap called Paul Stevenson, and he was a prison visitor, which I had no idea was what they meant, and so it was something very interesting to learn about what he did. And then the third guy was a chap called Robert Gladwell, and he did Round Britain Quiz. And at that time, Gilbert Harding and Lionel Hale were the 2 presenters. And Lionel Hale was the person who went through all the questions and also made up some for himself. And we also had questions from audience, from listeners. And technically, I had to ring up somebody in Manchester and somebody in Birmingham, I think, and somebody in Wales and somebody up in Edinburgh and somebody down in Bristol, probably. Anyhow, I had to ring each of the regional producers and about when certain people who were the quiz people would be available. There were regular chaps, they were always men, who were the team for either the North or the Scotland or Wales or whoever. And we had to get dates from them as to when they would be available, and they had to
This
offer.
was Round Britain Quiz.
This is Round Britain
Yes,
Quiz.
well, it's still on, of course, isn't it?
And then, yes.
It's still
and
on.
obviously I had to find out from Gilbert Harding and from Lionel Hale their dates for London. Gilbert would go to wherever the outlying team were, and Lionel and I and the producer, Robert Gladwell, would be in the London studio. And I had to do 2 sets of questions so that I had to type them out twice, so that the London team would get the questions and the answers to what was the opposing team's questions, and the opposing team would get the London questions and answers, so that they would be able to josh each other a bit, ho, you ought to know this sort of thing, going on.
Oh, right.
And I had to keep a note of the marks that were awarded, and then at the end add them up. And then Lionel would give Manchester have 6.5 and London have 3.5 or whatever it was, whatever the cues were.
I think the programme's still very much the same. Still
I
very
actually
similar.
got it wrong because I was trying to do that and time things and, keep an eye on what was happening and all the rest of it. Anyhow, after a while... Oh, and the other thing technically I had to do was you had to book music lines between wherever they were, between the 2 ends, A and B.
Yes.
And then I think after a while, the other thing was that they decided it was easier to pay for the outline team, so to speak, to come to London. And so even if we had 3A studio and 3B studio on the 3rd floor at Broadcasting House, you still had to book music lines between them and all the rest of it.
Really?
And for Gilbert, Gilbert always had hospitality, and he always had whiskey and water, and he had a secretary, his private secretary, a chap called Roger Story, who always came with Gilbert. And Gilbert quite often, because he suffered from emphysema, had to have an oxygen machine. And so his secretary would have to wheel him sometimes in a wheelchair, and he would have to be wheeled into the studio. He would obviously have to come up in the lift and be wheeled into the studio on occasions, because he was, very badly breathless and all the rest of it.
He was a heavy smoker, if I remember.
Well, I think he was, yes, but they didn't smoke in the studio that I remember particularly. Anyhow, there was one occasion when Edwina Mountbatten had died, and Lionel, when he wrote questions, he liked to introduce something that was in the news, the current headline, if you like. And so he wrote a question to do with Edwina Mountbatten, and the programme was always transmitted twice. And when the programme went out the first time, there was a complaint. A listener complained to the Director General saying, how could you possibly, this marvellous woman, what are you doing having her as part of a quiz programme? And this was raised with, I think at that time, the chap who was head of talks and current affairs, who was George Hills, although he was actually Jorge Camacho, but he was actually known as George Camacho, really. He came from South America. Anyhow, I was called in because Robert, as the producer, was up at Alexandra Palace, because he used to do continuity and news reading for television. And so I was called in by George Camacho and Janet Quigley, I think, probably, as his second. And there was much questioning as to whether this could be edited out. The Edwina Mountbatten programme could be edited out of the programme, out of that particular edition. And I said, well, A, it would make the programme, shall we say, 2 or 3 minutes short. And B, it would be very difficult because at the end of the programme, when they give the scores wouldn't make sense, Anyhow, they decided to let it go out again as it was, and nobody said a word. One thing I also did with that particular series was I did get a little postcard printed. The BBC had lots of postcards that you'd write with as part of their stationery. And I would dispatch to people who had sent in questions. A question sent in by you will be used in Round Britain Quiz London versus the North, episode 3 or something, to be broadcast on. And, I would fill in the details and send these off. So I hope I was doing something which was a nice little service for people. I mean, Gilbert Harding died the following year. He collapsed in a studio, and somebody else had taken over the programme. And actually, there was some slight hiccup over it because I had arranged, and I understood everything was clear. And there was the lines and everything booked, and the date was fixed, and this particular recording, and we would do 2 or 3 in a day. It would be over 2 days. So there would be 3 on one day and 2 on the other day for the 5 rounds that were for each series, if you like, each competition. And Robert then got in touch with me and said, oh, I can't manage that date. I'm going to be doing television. So I found myself in a bit of a quandary because I thought, all these people, I just don't see it. And so I went to see Janet Quigley and explained and said to her, look, I really don't know what I'm supposed to do about this, because here are 4 people, participants, plus Gilbert and Lionel, plus the studios, plus everything else I've arranged, etc., etc. And she said, right, I will settle Robert. And she just rang Robert and said, you're doing the Round Britain quiz. It's no question of your upsetting all these people, and cancelling that and rearranging everything. And he was not best pleased with me.
But he did it. Oh.
No, but yeah. I mean, I really didn't see what else I could have done.
No.
I then went on to work in a parliamentary department. And the producer I worked for was a chap called Archie Gordon, and he produced The Week in Westminster. At that time, and I'm now talking 1962, the idea was that an MP gave a little 15-minute resume of that week's events in Parliament, obviously when Parliament was sitting. Now, this was done on a Saturday. So Archie Gordon said to me, right, he worked Tuesday to Saturday, and I would be asked to work Tuesday to Saturday. So I had Sunday and Monday off. So I had 2 days off together, which was quite nice from my point of view, because it was quite unusual to have a weekday off completely. Anyhow, I also had to keep a log of all the MPs, because obviously they had to balance. There had to be a balance between Conservative and Labour and Liberal, as it was in those days. And that meant that Archie would go down to the House all afternoon, and he would obviously decide what he thought was interesting that week and what the points were and all the rest of it. And he would then organise whoever it was going to be the MP to come. And I was expected to turn up at Saturday at Broadcasting House. Archie's office was actually in what was now the new Broadcasting House, which at that time was a sort of H-shaped building on the back of the old Broadcasting House, and that has been knocked down and doesn't exist anymore. Anyhow, he had an office right up on the top floor, 7th floor. He and the MP would come in at 10 o'clock, and my first job was to get them a cup of coffee. And basically, I would then be handed the MP's scribble, his manuscript. It was often a man, occasionally it was a woman, but mostly I think it would have been a man. And I would type this out in triple spacing so that there was lots and lots of room for them to make whatever changes they wanted. And eventually it would get to lunchtime, and Archie and the MP would disappear for the lunch, and I would just take myself off. And I'd have to be back again by, shall we say, 2:30 or something. And then the final script would be worked out, and I would then have to type that out again, this time in double spacing, just to make it nice and clear. And then Archie and the MP would go off at about 4:30, depending on how many changes or amendments or whatever they wanted to make. And I was then free to go home. So I actually worked roughly 10 till 4:30 on a Saturday. And what was, I think, interesting from my point of view was that Oxford Street and everything, Saturday afternoons, shops closed at 1 o'clock. So I could walk straight down Regent Street, down to the park at the bottom, and listen to the band playing on the bandstand in the park, and there would be virtually nobody around. And tourist season was very much more marked in those days, and there would be Easter onwards, there would be more tourists around, but there would be virtually, apart from Christmas, there would be virtually nobody around.
The programme was recorded in the afternoon, was it?
Yeah, well, it was recorded at about 4:30-ish, 5 o'clock.
Yes.
And then it would go out at 6:15, because the Home Service News was from 6 to 6:15. Then there was the Week in Westminster, 6:15 to 6:30, and then there would be whatever programme, 6 to 7 o'clock, would be covered, presumably a comedy programme or something like that,
Yes,
I expect,
yes.
or something of that sort. Then, as I say, I would have Sunday and Monday off and go into the office again on the Tuesday. And then the other thing that Archie also dealt with was during the summer, when Any Questions took its break, he produced what was then also a live radio programme called Listeners Answer Back. And there was one speaker on the podium, so to speak, and there was a multi-audience, and there would be either Hugh Cudlip or George Scott, who were the chairman, and we would go out from London to places like Henley or Canvey Island or down to Lymington, I remember on one occasion, but all basically within a train journey of London. And they would have one person, like Ernest Marples, along with Hugh Cudlip, shall we say, and there was an assistant producer called Tony Moncrief, and he had to arrange the hall that we would be broadcasting from, and he had to get together an audience, and he had to get together questions, and we would get questions in advance in the office, and we would choose whatever was an appropriate person for an appropriate subject in an area. And Ernest Marple talked about planning, I remember, and we had Dorian, somebody who was very much into hunting, and of course hunting was a very controversial subject.
Yes.
And I can't remember now exactly where we held that, but the thing was, at the beginning of the programme, because it was live, and we had obviously an engineer on the spot, and it was inevitably the same engineer, and I regret to say I can't remember his name, but Hugh Cudlip or George Scott would introduce whoever it was, and then we would cut, then they would go to the audience and their questions. And I had to type out all the questions, and when we were in the hall, extra questions would come in and they would decide which questions they were going to ask and which order they were going to ask them in. Then I would have to have my portable typewriter with me, and I would have to type them all out. And I would have to type copies, obviously, for the chairman and for the person who was asking the question. And the engineer would have a roving microphone, so he would walk around the hall, and we would try and make sure that each of the people were in a reasonable place for him to get to, and we would ask people to move and whatever else they were doing. And on the occasion when we had the programme about hunting, the engineer didn't quite hear when the cut from presentation was coming and when we were actually on air. And so there was a great deal of hunting horn noise and stamping of feet going on, etc. And questions were asked afterwards about, where all this noise was coming from. And Archie said he thought it was great because, it added marvellous atmosphere to the programme. Anyhow, so we did that for the remaining sort of July, August type, when Any Questions took its summer break. And then towards the end of September, October, we did the annual party political conferences. We didn't do the trade union conference, but we covered the party ones. That meant going to seaside resorts because there were plenty of hotels with plenty of rooms available and so on. So obviously each party would choose for itself, and we would go to somewhere like Brighton or even Scarborough or Llandudno or whatever. I remember going to Liverpool. Blackpool we went to. So we would set up a studio, and the engineer would set up in the next door bedroom his equipment, technical recordings office. And then we would have somebody who was reporting on the conference. So it would be an MP or a political celebrity, if you like, of one sort and another, well-known political figure who would be commenting on the... And then there were people like Hardeman Scott and Robert Holmes. And during the daytime, there would be a long queue of caravans, mobile vans, which were the television vans, but also we had two for radio. And we had one that was the engineers' caravan, and one that was our caravan that we used for logging. And we had to, the entire conference would be recorded live onto 15 IPS, and the engineers would come into our caravan and swap the tapes over, and there would always be a sort of 2-minute overlap between the tapes. And then we were on two-way talkback with the reporters on the conference floor, and we could ask the reporters for a check on who was speaking and what their position was in the government, you know, or whether they were a minister or just a delegate or whatever. And we would have to log exactly when the chairperson of the conference opened up proceedings. We had to time it all on big log sheets, and then the report and who spoke when and roughly what their subject matter was and who was speaking, and obviously whatever questions came up from the delegates and all the rest of it. And then the reporters would tell us that they would like to have an extract from so-and-so's speech, beginning whatever, and finishing on whatever was whatever. And we had to make a note of this, write this down on a little slip, and then take them through to the engineers' caravan, and they would then lift that extract off the master tape and put it onto a 7.5-inch standard tape, 1/4-inch tape. And then that would be ready to play into what was either the lunchtime news or the evening, or 6 o'clock news or evening news. And we also had a liaison officer for the chaps at Bush House, because obviously if the Foreign Secretary was speaking or trade person, they would be particularly interested. So that we had to keep logs of absolutely everything for the entire day. And then there were always two of us together in the caravan, so that if one of us left, the other person would be, you know, we would both keep a log and all the rest of it. And then at the end of the conference, I would be joining Archie Gordon and Tony Moncrief as his assistant, and also Hardeman Scott and Robin Holmes and whoever else was there. And we would have a light meal of some sort. Then they would have a script for me to type, you know, headlines or whatever else they wanted. And that I would then stay for the 10 o'clock transmission and time whatever the length of contribution was, and note definitely who had been quoted and all the rest of it. And if there was some delegate who was quoted, then that person had to have a contract and so on. So it was all very proper and all the rest of it. In Brighton, there was already a studio in the pavilion, and you got there by going in through the back door of the pavilion and going up a couple of flights. And the room wasn't that much bigger than this room, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And it had the most beautiful Regency furniture in it and a superb table in the middle. And of course, that meant that the table had to be completely covered with very soft cloth and so on, because otherwise would get a lot of reverberation off the top of the table.
Yes.
And everything had to be treated terribly carefully. You had to pussyfoot your way around everything. Anyhow, and then towards the end of October, after the conferences were over, then Archie would go for discussions with the archives people to decide what would be kept in the archives as a permanent record of that particular conference or whatever it was, for the all three of them, eventually at the end. Macmillan was there, was Prime Minister, and there was, I think it was 63, when what was known as the Night of the Long Knives, when he axed or slaughtered, whatever way you put it, axed a third of his cabinet. And also at that time in the early 60s, it turned out that there had been a lot of pressure, particularly by Lord Stansgate, as he was, to renounce his title so that he could carry on as an MP. And the law was then passed to agree that people could indeed renounce their titles. So it meant that Lord Stansgate, of course, became Anthony Wedgwood Benn and became Tony Benn subsequently. And Lord Hume became Sir Alec Douglas Hume. And Lord Hailsham became Quintin Hogg again. And then when he was made a life peer, he went back to being Lord Hailsham. And I think it was in 1964, we had Mark Bonham Carter and Tony Benn, and I can't remember now who the Conservative person was, but he got, if you like, an opposing view on the different party. So I think Tony Benn commented on the Liberals and Mark Bonham Carter commented on the Conservatives, and then the Conservatives commentated on the Labour. So they did it like that for a change.
Were you interested in politics, or did you
Well, I
develop
just
an
thought it
interest?
was very interesting. Yes, I did. I mean, I was getting more interesting. And I should have asked Archie, actually, because I should have said to him, I'd love to know what it's like to be down in the House of Commons when they're actually having a debate. Because you could just walk into the back of the House of Commons, or you could walk into the sort of lobby area and everything without any let or hindrance,
But you never went down there.
Well, I did go down on one occasion, but Archie had taken himself off somewhere and he wasn't there. And I did have a quick word with the parliamentary and political correspondents and so on. But
Now, this is now getting towards the mid-60s.
yes, I worked with him up until the end of 1964. And during that autumn, I applied for a job in television, and it was at that stage in 1965, beginning of 65, I became a television secretary, programme secretary, and I was assigned to Lime Grove, not so much a programme, more a way of life.
Really?
And Ned Sherrin was, of course, the Supremo.
Yes.
And there's follow-up series 2, that was the week that was. And they went out 3 nights a week, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And I was attached to the little film unit that had to produce 3 little films per week, which was anything between sort of 3 and 4 minutes long. And we had an office in one of the front rooms of Lime Grove, actual houses. And to get there, you had to go through the main entrance and out into a courtyard and then back in through the back door of the particular house. And we had the ground floor or room, front room. So we looked out onto the street, in fact. And there were 3 men who were all called John. And there was John Duncan, John Stoneman, and John Angier. Anyhow, to distinguish between the 3 of them, John Duncan was known as Jack, so he was Jack Duncan. Then there was John Stoneman, and then there was Jonathan Angier. Jack Duncan was basically the sort of head of the little unit, and John Angier was actually the sort of AFM, and he sorted out all the props and locations and whatever was necessary.
Were they comedy inserts?
They tended to be comedy inserts, yes.
Okay.
Because we had Roy Hudd, we had Cleo Lane, they had Brian Murphy, Barbara Evans sometimes took part, and they participated in whatever the little vignettes were that we did. And we had a permanent film crew. Anyhow, they were permanently handed out on this series. And to some extent, one of the difficulties was that when it got to Friday, the film editor was so brought up busy cutting for 3 films, for 3 programmes, for 3 successive nights, that in a way, really, unless there was something absolutely happening on the Friday which had to be filmed, the film unit was just sitting around. So I did suggest to Jack Duncan, was there any point in having them on call on the Friday? You know, it might be better just to let them go. Anyhow, so that was agreed, and they came to us Monday to Thursday, and they went off and did whatever film unit got them to do on the Friday, which quite often was probably a free day, actually, as far as they were concerned. It was a great learning curve as far as I was concerned, because the lass, I was supposed to have had a week's overlap at the beginning with the lass who was going on to whatever else she was going to, except she turned up on the Monday morning looking like death warmed up. She was absolutely in a most horrendous, feverish, flu-like state. Lasted for about half an hour with me and more or less just said, here you are, here's the paperwork, this is what happens, and that was it, and she disappeared. And so I had to learn absolutely, and I had no idea about film terminology. I mean, I knew virtually nothing about, it was all 16mm.
Black and white.
All black and white film. Sound recorders still had to be connected to the camera with a sync lead. The electrician, quite often, he had to have a transformer, so he had to hump this transformer around with him, because obviously, though mind you, quite a lot of it was done with as few light as possible, as few lighting requirements as possible. I do remember that there was an item in the papers about the fact that the French had said you couldn't clean your car in the street. And so we had this little vignette of Roy Hudd being the husband, Cleo Lane being the wife, and Brian Murphy being the French policeman. And I happened to have a large black duffel coat that I'd had from my mother. And the idea was that Cleo Lane had my duffel coat on, and she covered what was a bucket of water, ostensibly, so that she was pretending to be pregnant, and in order to try and get the bucket to the car for her husband and her possibly to wash it. And here was Brian Murphy being the French policeman.
Yes.
So that was quite jolly. And then there was another occasion when we actually spent a night away and we went up to Oxford, and I can't remember now quite what the storyline was, but we had them all lined up riding bicycles down sort of Oxford main road in one way or another.
High Street, yes.
And then the other time we had was Carnaby Street, which was coming into fashion. And on a Sunday morning, we then filmed, because nobody was open on Sundays in those days, so we filmed in Carnaby Street on a Sunday morning and did lots of tracking shots and things. So I had to learn about things like panning and zooming and tracking shots and, rolling legs and things.
You had to do a shot list.
I had to do a shot list.
So you needed to know the jargon.
Well, I had to really learn the jargon, yes, absolutely. Obviously in radio it didn't work quite like that. I mean, I had a lot of timings and things to do in radio, but obviously, there was a whole lot more to do when it came to shot listing and all the rest of it for television filming.
What was your opinion of Lime Grove? I mean, did you wander around? It was an extraordinary place, wasn't it?
I quite enjoyed being in Lime Grove.
Complete rabbit warren.
And I think, yes, but I mean, the thing was, in order to get to Ned's office, you had to go sort of out of the house and into the next door and then up 3 or 4 floors and all the rest of it. But I mean, you just took that in your stride. I mean, at that age, as in my 20s, it wasn't a hardship to me. And going up and down outside iron staircases and so on,
yes.
So, you just...
What was Ned Sherrin like to work for?
Well, I didn't really have a lot to do with him, because really we were a sort of self-sufficient little unit. And obviously Jack or John would go up and talk to Ned about what they were thinking of offering and what was appropriate and where they could go and all the rest of it. And I must admit, I was a bit stunned by how cavalier it seemed to me people were about the cost of things. Because if we had a script coming in, it wasn't just posted to us, and it wasn't even an ordinary dispatch rider. We would order a taxi to pick up a script from Croydon, shall we say, and bring it up to Lime Grove. And I was very surprised by all this. I thought I wasn't entirely surprised, really, I suppose, when John Burt took over and said, life has got to be rather less expensive, we can't afford all this.
That was a long time in the future.
Yes.
No, I mean, the BBC was pretty well off then.
I think it probably was, yes.
Now, colour television had come in, BBC Two had started.
Yes, Hullabaloo and Custard, 1962 and all that was very much... I do remember the kangaroo and the baby Roo in its pocket and all the rest of it.
But also, I mean, they were doing things in colour by then.
What I do remember, just for a wee moment going back to radio, was that in 1964 there was a general election and US television wanted to come and cover it in, the UK elections. And so they were going to do it in colour. And so they had, I think it was Television Centre 1, Studio 1, and they wanted volunteers for people to run between the results table to the graphics table with that particular numbers, and they would then be copied off on letteraset by the graphics people, and you then had to put it onto the stand for the camera to pick up and do the results. So I can remember, because of the television being American and colour, we wore slightly sort of orangey tanny type overalls, which had slightly pleated skirts, if I remember.
Yeah.
They were buttoned down the front.
Yes.
So they were like a sort of semi-frock, sort of short sleeves, because the studio was quite hot with lots of extra lighting, of course.
Yes.
Anyhow, so that was while I was still in radio. Then, yes, colour was coming in, but we weren't involved in doing any colour at that time. No, I wasn't.
So you were at Lime Grove working on
Not so much a programme.
not so much a programme. And
And
then,
that was 3 months, sort of January, February, March. And then that came to an end. And I was then sent on a production course or a training course.
Yes.
And of course, by that time, I'd learned a lot about what happened as far as filming was concerned.
Of course.
But I had very little idea about what happened in the studio.
Yeah. When did the move to Villiers House take place?
Oh, well, we started off in Kensington House.
Oh,
So I was assigned to schools television, and I then started with Gordon Croton, who had also, I think, come from radio.
Mm-hmm.
I think he'd come from Radio 3, which was known as the Fretwork Network. Anyhow, I started off with him, and we did Going to Work. And that was, as the title implies, programme for 15, 16-year-old secondary modern kids, and jobs they could do.
yeah.
And they were 20-minute programmes. And to start with, Peter West was the presenter. And he also did Come Dancing, of course, and he did all the cricket commentary. But he presented and he chatted to the young people and all the rest of it. And he talked to, managers and whatever the job was about, and to get people to explain what the job entailed and so on. And we also at that time had producers who were based in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. And they did their own programme, 20-minute, for the series. And the very first year I worked on it, we did 12 programmes. We did a programme a month. We had to have enough for something like 28 to 30 programmes per year. So, shall we say, 20 were repeats from previous years, and 10 were new ones. 10 or 12 were new ones. And just occasionally we did a studio programme, but mainly they were on location, at the job, whatever it was.
So by this time you were an experienced film PA, as
Yes,
it were.
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew okay about filming, absolutely.
Sure.
And we, again, film department tended to allocate 4 particular camera men who dealt with schools programming in particular. And they were Mike Shepherd and Phil Law and Sid Davis and Stan Spiel. And they were the camera people. We nearly always had one or other of them. And I had a very exciting first programme, I remember, because the Wales, I think, had covered the army previously. And so on this occasion, it was decided we would try and do the Royal Air Force. And so and we had to find something that was for young women to do. And so the Air Force decided that they had kennel maids and looked after the dogs, obviously the guard dogs and so on. And so we actually went to Cyprus, to the Sovereign Base area, where we filmed the kennel maids doing their guard dogging round the Sovereign Base area in Cyprus. And we flew out there from Lynham in Wiltshire, and we were in a plane where you sat facing the back of the plane. You didn't face forward. because it was obviously safer if there'd ever been a crash, which fortunately there wasn't. What rather miffed the crew as far as the Sovereign base area was concerned, we were there for about 5 days, was that when you're on government property, as this was, you didn't pay the equivalent of purchase tax or VAT or whatever it was. So that you didn't pay the tax on alcohol. So that as far as Gordon and I were concerned, if you had a whiskey or a gin with lemon or whatever, a tonic, then it cost you 9p. Whereas if you had a pint of bitter, which is what the crew wanted, or a pint of lager, that cost you 1 shilling and 6p. So it was, twice as expensive to drink beer as it was to drink spirits.
Yeah. These were all film programmes?
They were all filmed. There was occasionally a programme done studio-based, but that was pretty rare. Oh, and I might just mention, for what it's worth, we were given £3 10 shillings for a 24-hour allowance. And what you had was the £3 10 shillings was meant to cover the fact that you had bed and breakfast and an evening meal, but obviously you had to pay for your usual midday meal, whatever you wanted to do, or whatever entertainment you wanted, and so on. And this got a bit difficult because gradually I used to have to ring up and book guest houses or B&Bs or something, for as near as we could get to where we were going. And it got quite difficult, actually, and sometimes we would actually be asked by the crew if we knew anywhere, or I would ask the crew if they knew anywhere locally, because obviously they'd done much more travelling than we had at that time. So sometimes I would be booking for the crew as well as myself and Gordon. And then they decided they would up the rate, and we got £4 10 shillings, I think it was, for 24. So they gave us another whole extra pound, not just the extra 10 shillings, but another whole extra pound.
Luxury, yes. Now, you were still at Kensington House?
No, they decided to move the schools programme, and there were schools department, and I think there were other schools people up in the Langham and also in Sulgrave House or something like that. Anyhow, we were a bit scattered as a department, and so they decided to move everybody, including the continuing or further education, into Villiers House on top of Ealing Broadway Station. So we all got together, if you like, as education departments, plural, because we were still separate.
Now, which year was that when you moved?
Oh, gosh. It would have been about 67, 68?
Yes,
No, it wouldn't have
yes.
been more than a couple of years later, I think, yes.
Kenneth Fordry was running schools?
Kenneth Fordry was running schools.
And Donald Grattan presumably was
Don
running
Grattan would have
further
been,
education.
yes.
Yeah. Now, when was your first experience of getting into a gallery? At some stage, you started working in the studios as presumably a PA.
Yes, I mean, I think the first... I did the series on nursing. Gordon decided he had done enough of going to work, and we'd done it all round the UK. And it was up to somebody else to get some new ideas for the series. And he also had to write or produce what were pupils' pamphlets and teachers' notes. So there was quite a lot of printing and typing from that point of view as well. And we had education officers, of course. And there was sort of audience research as well on some things. And I can remember we had cards which the teachers would send back with their comments if they wanted. And I can remember a teacher saying that they turned the sound down and talked through the entire programme with their own commentary.
Oh.
I never quite knew. I wondered what they said. However, the studio series I had, which was film but studio based, was this series on nursing and nursing techniques. And Gordon decided to ask a woman doctor, as it so happened, to present the series. And so I must have been able to cope with that not too badly. Anyhow, it created a bit of a furore because nurses didn't take kindly to the idea of a doctor telling them what to do. And so we had to remake the series. And this time we went for an absolute doyenne of the nursing profession. She was the chief nursing officer of Bart's Hospital, and she was now retired and actually had one of those little flats in the newly built Barbican. Anyhow, she then came and did the studio presentation. So basically, all we had to do was to record her inserts and then exchange them. So I think probably when it came to the original studio, we just recorded mainly what the presenter was doing, and then they got cut into the film. You know, it got edited together. So it wasn't like doing a full programme.
Were you scared by television studios?
I wasn't scared so much. I was apprehensive.
Yes.
Certainly, and I certainly felt there was a certain amount of pressure around. You know, you had to time the inserts, you had to keep an eye on the programme length, you had to know about how long the presenter could have, and you had to warn the director, you know, you've only got 5 minutes left, you know, and he needs to be speed up or whatever it was.
But you'd also had to produce camera scripts and call out the shots
yes.
and things like that.
Well, I suppose I found that fairly formulaic, actually, because, you know, that was a fairly routine type thing. You know, you had a script and you extracted that, the camera shots, camera cards from the script, you know. Sure. So it only took reasonable intelligence, actually, to produce a camera script, you know, or camera cards for that.
But you had videotape recording. It was fairly new, but it was still...
Yes, and the thing was, it was 2-inch Philips tapes, I remember. That was interesting to see. And also, a bit like in the dubbing theatre, there were times when I felt the dubbing was a bit over-enthusiastic with music to cover things and so on. And I occasionally felt that with the colour streaming, when we got to colour on studio presentation, that there was a bit of saturation that was a bit over the top, I felt sometimes. But I mean, you know, that was up to the producers concerned.
We should explain that this is being recorded on November the 5th, which explains the background noise.
Yes, I'm afraid that's true.
Yes. You worked at Villiers House in that department, continuing education, when you moved from schools to continuing education.
Yes, we moved from schools into continuing education, yes.
And then did you stay there more or less till the end?
Then what happened was, Gordon went to Elstree, to the training department.
Ah, yes.
And I went to Mike Weatherly and did a series in Australia, which was with David Bellamy.
Oh, yes.
Called Upper Gumtree, eventually.
Yes.
And so I had 3 months in Australia, which I very much enjoyed, obviously, because we went from our November to, which was our winter, from November to February, and it was the Australian summer. And we landed in Sydney and went up and started in Sydney, and then we went up the coast to Cairns, stopping off to film at various places with various natural history people and so on, botanists and so on. And then we went across to Papua New Guinea, where we were supposed to be filming cycads, I think, and various things of that sort. And it absolutely poured with rain because it was still the end of the monsoon season. And the whole thing became impossible. I mean, it just wasn't possible to film.
Really?
Everything got absolutely soaked, and the electrics, for the camera and the recording and all the rest of it, all got too much. It was just too much. And so we had to abandon Papua New Guinea.
That surely would have been predictable, wouldn't it?
Well, to some extent. I mean, it's like global warming, you would think
Yeah.
things were predictable. But actually, by the time we got there, which would have been the beginning of December, the monsoon should have been over. But of course it wasn't, I mean, it decided it was still lingering, and it was just too much. And so we had to get out of Papua New Guinea and back to Cairns. And then we went all the way round the top through Darwin and Atherton and things, Atherton, Darwin, and we stopped off at a sheep station. And then we went all the way down to the west coast and all the way down through Perth. And
Fascinating.
we got to Perth by Christmas, I think it was. We then went across to Alice Springs and filmed in the hot centre.
Yeah.
And we never went to Adelaide, as it so happened. We then went on back to Sydney, and that was then when we had the break for Christmas. And then after Christmas, we went down to Melbourne, and then back up to Sydney for the final bit. And I ended up flying round the world, actually, as it so happened, because we went from London to Sydney, and then I went from Sydney across to Canada, to Vancouver, and then back that way. So when I got back from Australia, I then had a 3-month attachment to Television Centre, to what they called the Hearts and Minds unit. And at that time, which was 1979, the BBC was into encouraging the audience to be sympathetic towards the BBC. They had a unit which was run by Brian Denny that took people on tours around Television Centre. And so you could have a bunch of people from the army, or you could have individuals who came from, shall we say, South Australian TV or whatever, So, and there were 3 or 4 of us. So I was only there just for this sort of 3 months, and I would take people round Television Centre. And if there were a group of people, then 2 of us would do it, and we would have roughly 8, 9, 10 people each. And we would arrange with whatever studio was going on if we could bring people into the observation gallery for people to see what was happening in the gallery and on the studio floor and all the rest of it. And we would take them into the props department and show them Ronnie Corbett's chair, or we would take them into makeup or whatever. We would arrange with whatever department. And also things like, editing suite or etc., etc. And we would show them an audience studio, So we were taking people round on tours in the hope of sort of influencing people and getting them sympathetic. What I do remember about the army group was they were sort of busily calculating how they could take over Television Centre, which I thought was rather nice.
Did you have MPs as well? Because they're the people whose hearts and minds you
I
needed.
don't think I ever did. I certainly had people from Hong Kong, Hong Kong television.
Yes.
And I had this chap from South Australia TV, and I was amazed when he told me that 2 minutes of every 10 were taken up by advertising. As far as they were concerned, they cut everything into 8-minute chunks.
8-minute chunks, yes.
Because they were a commercial station. So,
But I mean, in those days, Television Centre was an absolute joy to look at because it was so beautifully organised.
It
Everything was very efficient, very
think,
productive,
yes,
very
absolutely.
professional.
I think, yes, it was a good time to be showing people
Yeah.
round, Then after that, my 3 months with that, I then went back to continuing education.
Yeah.
And I became what I suppose I chose to call myself a clerk, really, or a liaison officer, to the CEO, Tom Weimer. And the idea was that by that time, the
CEO being
department had...
continuing education organiser.
Yes, by the time that was going on, there were people known as executive producers.
Yes.
And I had to organise group meetings for each of the executor producers. And they would have sort of mini department type meetings. And there would be liaison meetings. And obviously, I suppose probably David Hargreaves by then, possibly. And Tom and whoever was the executive producer.
John Radcliffe.
John Radcliffe. Peter Riding.
Peter
possibly?
Riding, yes.
Anyhow, and then also it was decided to repeat certain science programmes, only they needed to be edited from something like 50 minutes down to 30. So I had to get the scripts and then edit them as best I could and take them into a cutting room or a video editing suite and cut them down into 30-minute programmes for transmission later. So I was looking after that lot. And then after that, I then went on to making the most of the micro. Which
No names, no pack drill.
That's right. And so, obviously, to some extent, I was a bit apprehensive about doing such a very concentrated studio series.
Yes.
I think I more or less acquitted myself okay, but I found it, because of the sort of casualness of filmmaking, or you had to be precise, but in some ways, and you had to be aware of timings and continuity and all sorts of things. And of course, in a studio, you didn't have to worry about continuity in the same way, because things just happen, boom, 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 boom.
Yes.
But, you had to get your timings right and cue in telecine and tell people to stand by and, time things and so on. In a much more precise way.
And these programmes presumably were being recorded almost as live. In other words, you tried to avoid stopping.
That's right. Yes.
Which is much more stressful.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I can remember on the very last programme, Tom's secretary, Diane Creswell, had been acting as a sort of assistant to me, and I said to her, OK, your turn to become the main production assistant. And I did the assistant production secretary bit in the studio. I think she found it quite a strain, yes. Yeah. She came filming with me and had to do filming, and I did my best, and she was fine, as far as I could tell. The difficulty was, and even I fell prey to this or slackened off, was my shorthand, because I realised I really wasn't doing shorthand in the same way. I mean, gone were the days when having to take down what the presenter said and all the rest of it. And so I have to admit, when it got to doing Women Mean Business, which was much later, towards the end of my time, we had Glenda Jackson presenting the series, and she came on location with us, and she was asking very long-winded questions as far as I was concerned, and I wasn't very good at getting it all down in shorthand. And of course, being an actress, she had plenty of memory. She was good at memorising things, and I was in this awful position of having to say to the recordist, could he play it back for her so we could take the cutaways? And so she wasn't very impressed by my efficiency, I have to say.
Oh dear.
Because that was something I had to do with the Bellamy series, was I had to have a lead attached to the recorder in order to record onto my own individual cassette recorder. I also had to make a note of what the opening sentence was that David Bellamy gave, because he was totally unscripted. He would just give an introduction, an ad hoc piece, and also make a note of what he said in the end. And then there would be all the continuity notes as what he was actually doing in the shot, all the rest of it. And there was one occasion when he said to me, "What's that, the right hand or the left hand?" And I said to him, "Look, I am recording this. I am making a note of what you're saying. I have to make a note of what the shot is actually doing and the camera is doing." And I said, "It only takes 10 seconds for you to point with your left hand or your right hand, depending.
Why not do
it's
both?
Not exactly, you reels and reels of tape, because he was getting a bit tetchy about things.
Oh,
I thought, oh gosh, come on. Anyhow, so altogether, making the most of the micro, I can remember going off and doing filming with different directors. And there were 2 directors, and me and the film crew, were going all the way around. So we went down to somewhere like Bristol, then we had to go round into Wales, then we had to go up to Scunthorpe, I think, right the way across the other part. And then we had to come down somewhere else. I can remember the cameraman saying that it was a bit like a rally with pit stops, because it depended who was directing. Because it was very box and cox on that occasion. Anyhow, we succeeded and did it all.
Yeah.
I then went to do a European, I think it was, co-production, which was Peter Dunkley doing a series with other European television stations, and we swapped them around. So I can remember that RTL, Radio Television Luxembourg,
yes,
they went off and did an interview with Deng Xiaoping.
Good Lord.
And they did it in French, and Deng Xiaoping obviously spoke in Chinese. And they simply handed what they had shot to Peter Dunkley to edit whatever he meant. And they did provide him, though, with French transcript of what the French director had asked, and a French rendition of what Deng Xiaoping had said. And we then got in touch with Bush House and the Chinese section, and we, not surprisingly, perfectly fairly, we paid for a Chinese translator to come and translate what Deng Xiaoping had said into English. Because Peter had made he was a very good French linguist himself.
Yes.
And he had made a very good translation into English of all this. But obviously we needed to have it double checked as to quite whether this Chinese into French into English was actually accurate. Anyhow, he came along and made, recommendations and made some comments about Deng Xiaoping and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And we then had to subtitle everything. And subtitles had to be absolutely timed. Absolutely. Yes. None of this sort of ad hoc stuff you get nowadays, sort of 10 seconds late if you're lucky.
No, absolutely not.
Everything had to be absolutely subtitled.
Yes.
And obviously virtually all the programmes had to be subtitled, because they were German and this French. And we went to Turkey and did a programme about Turkey and had a very splendid time. Peter was very good at taking us off places. He enjoyed going places. That was very enjoyable, yes.
So that was good.
I can remember we actually did not get an aeroplane that was hijacked because we were going from Ankara down to Darsan or something on the south coast.
Yes.
And we could have got a plane that would have taken us to, somewhere. But unfortunately we didn't. We just decided the thing to do was just to go straight down to wherever. And the plane we might have got was then hijacked. But otherwise, no, it was fine. And so we sent teleprinter messages. I can remember there was the recordist was a chap called Julian something, and he actually was very good at teleprinters. So he sent off teleprinters saying, it's all right, we're okay, because we didn't want, obviously, either my office or film department to think that we had somehow been hijacked, whatever. And no news is not news when it's that sort of situation.
Yes,
so I learned how to do teleprinting and all the rest of it,
Yes.
And then, and then I went with Bernard Adams. Actually, was doing this program with Sachs. Anyhow, the Faulty Towers chap.
Oh, you mean Andrew Sachs?
That's right. Bernard had worked with Sachs on the... he'd taken him to Spain as the Emmanuel chap and had done a Spanish series.
Yes.
And so because Sachs had experienced personally the Kristallnacht and all that, and his family had got out, we went and did this series about Berliners, and he was the interviewer and presenter and all the rest of it. And so I went to Berlin in 1988, it would have been, the year before the wall came down. So we had to have visas to get through into East Berlin. And when we went on the metro, the line went very slowly through the East Berlin sector. And all the doors on the train stayed locked, of course, and all the rest of it. Anyhow, we went to Checkpoint Charlie and we did various things and interviewed people and so on. And I had to drive a car because Bernard and Sachs, they wanted to sit in the back and have a chat about things. And I had to drive the car. And of course, I had to drive a left-hand drive car on the right-hand side of the road, which was all right, but in the middle of Berlin was a bit hair-raising. However, I managed it okay. Yeah. I worked with Howard Smith on a series called Two Nations, and it included people like Frank Field and Richard Layard and people who were very socially committed people and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And we went to places like Liverpool. And then I worked with Peter Riding, and we went to Brazil for him. And I spent a lot of my time in the favelas, I have to say, not the most enjoyable time.
No.
Because that was pretty sticky and muddy and horrid.
Yes.
And then I went to Italy on an Italian language series with David Cordingley, and that was slightly confusing because he had started off with Marian Allinson and another PA, and they had got rather upset by the whole way the thing was happening. And so they had decided to withdraw from participating anymore in that particular series. And so I was asked, along with a researcher called Daniela, who was Italian speaking. So she and I and David, and we drove to Italy, and it was his car, so we were driving a right-hand drive car on the right-hand side of the road. And we stayed one night somewhere like Strasbourg or something. And then we made it all the way down to Umbria, which is where this was happening. So it was all like Assisi and things like that, which was very fascinating.
Yes.
And he had a family from Sheffield, father and mother and sort of teenage type kids, who were ostensibly trying to learn some Italian and how easy Italian was to learn and all the rest of it. And only the son in particular was very shy about participating or saying anything, which wasn't surprising.
Yeah.
The other series I did with Lucy was a series called The Coming of Age, which was all to do with once you get into your 70s plus, what was available at that time and the care that you could have either outside or in your home, or what the sort of state could offer in those days. The final series I worked on was with Mary Sprent, and this was another European series, but it was to do with students working abroad, the opportunities they had for doing work abroad on a sort of gap year or whatever. And so we went across the Channel, we went to Paris and to Frankfurt in Germany, and that was basically the last series I worked on. And then in 1991, by that time we had already moved to the White City. The BBC decided to give up Villiers House and pretty much combine the two departments into one education department. And we had this very strange, to me it felt like, and I think a lot of people found it a bit strange, was to have an open plan office. And it so happened I was in the middle, Mary and I were in the middle, so there was one set of desks that were right up against one window, and one set of desks and space that was right up against the other window. And then there was this sort of middle section which Mary and I occupied, which wasn't very comfortable to work in. And you had to share your filing cabinets, and drawers were sort of round the corner and between you and in the aisle and somebody else and all the rest of it.
Yes. I don't think you liked that. I think you liked having your own office.
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, you could organise yourself according to how you wanted it.
Yes.
I mean, I can remember sending off a whole series of programmes, which were 10 programmes, and I had filed the correspondent all according to the surname letter. So I knew exactly who was who, and I could tell who had appeared in which programme and all the rest of it. And the series was repeated. So I asked for the correspondence file to be sent back so that I could look up, and I could just look A for Andrews or something, and that would tell me whether that person had appeared in programme 1 or 10 or whatever, very quick. Instead of which somebody in the records office had obviously deputed some minion to file everything according to date order. So I had to look through the entire correspondence in order to find out who had appeared in what programme, because it just wasn't obvious anymore. That's why, I like to take control.
And if you'd had your own office, this wouldn't have happened.
Yes, had my own office and knew what I was on about.
Yes.
However,
well, look, it's November the 5th. We ought to go out with a bang.
Well, I don't know that... Oh, well, probably. Anyhow, just to say, I decided in 92, and the BBC was offering itself downsizing and offering redundancy. I thought, why not? Because I'd been working for a whole lot of different people, and I didn't feel I was sort of getting on with any one particular person. I thought, I've been there, I've done it, to be honest.
Yes.
And so I took the offer of redundancy and departed in 1993.
And you haven't looked back, I hope not.
No, indeed I haven't. Yes, I did go to the odd Villiers House reunion and all the rest of it. Yes.
Quite. Fenella, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you very much for the tea and biscuits, which I have much enjoyed.